Hi, my name's Eryn. Nice to see you all. I would really like to get a little sense of you guys and what your priorities and desires are before we go into this, so I can tailor it a little bit. So who is here because you have a lawn that you want to convert to a low water garden? Who has just like a bunch of weeds and dirt that you want to convert to a low water garden? Who is most concerned about all the different reasons to do this? Who's most concerned about water? And who's more concerned about pollinators or birds, things like that? Who has like a really different reason? They're like, I don't care about pollinators or water. I want something else. Anybody? Yeah.
I'm on a very, well, both of those things, but I'm also on a very steep hill, and I'm trying to keep the hill from becoming a cliff.
Erosion, awesome, yeah. Erosion, beauty, low maintenance, those are good reasons, right? Any other reasons out there to do something like this? Yeah.
I want more space for vegetable garden.
More space for vegetable garden, I like that. Yeah.
I want to improve my soil quality.
Improve your soil quality, I love it, okay. Well, I'm really into habitat restoration, that's my thing. When I think about how beautiful Colorado is, still is, the reason most of us are here is to enjoy the beauty of Colorado. I get really interested in what Denver looked like before colonization. It was short grass prairie, which means it was a mix of short flowers and short grasses. It looks something like this. This is Pawnee Butte short grass prairie in Denver. If you look at this map, you can see, I don't know, am I gonna wander out of the camera's view if I go over here? Okay, so if you look at this map, you can see that Prairie Plains is this whole yellow area, right, including Denver, and then you start to get up into foothills, light green, and mountains. Each of those have different plant communities that are native to that area, meaning they have plants that were growing there and thriving there before anyone was watering them or anyone was taking care of them, and they looked gorgeous. So here on the high plains, again, short grass prairie, short flowers. As you get into the foothills, you get more bushes, slightly different palette of flowers, but still a lot of overlap. And then as you get higher, you guys hopefully have all seen some beautiful Colorado mountain meadows, full of wildflowers and forests. But instead we just have lawn, right? We just have lawn everywhere. I don't know if you guys know that much about the history of lawn, but once upon a time in Europe, the nobility were creating these castles in the forest, and you can't have a tree right next to your castle because then the enemy will scale the tree and climb into the castle, right? So you have to have a cleared area around the castle to keep yourself safe from people scaling your walls. Over time, that evolves into, well, what should we do with these cleared areas? Let's turn them into pretty gardens to host these lavish parties, and then it becomes a style with the nobility and it trickles down. Now we come here and we're still doing this. We're still creating these sort of like pointless party spaces in front of our houses that sometimes in some places, in some homes get used. Sometimes they get a lot of play, and that's great. Those are great reasons to have a lawn, but sometimes they're just sort of ornamental. And it seems really silly to me because this was short grass prairie, so there were already grasses growing here that you don't have to mow or water in the long term and that create lawns. This is me standing in my buffalo grass lawn. Buffalo grass is one of the keystone plants to our ecosystem. It's native, it only grows 6 inches tall, and then it stops, and you don't have to water it in the long term. But do you know about this? How many of us know about this? It's wild, okay? Instead, we're gonna water and we're gonna mow every week, a grass that doesn't really belong here because it's from the high mountains of Europe. So a lot of this is just, we are in a process as a culture, as a city, as a society of readjusting the things that we have been doing to strategies that are smarter, that are easier, and of course that use less water. So we all know that water is a big issue. 40%, I believe, of our urban water goes towards lawns. That's a lot. And the more water we use, the less water there is for streams, the less water there is for downstream farmers, et cetera, et cetera. So any little bit that we can save is doing our part. The other thing that's really cool about the plants that we're growing here is that they have really deep roots. They have really deep roots because they need to be able to draw water up from deep in the soil during times of drought, right? So they focus on growing straight down and creating these fibrous networks that also help with erosion, help with flooding, hold the soil together, and are really low maintenance as we go through periods of drought here in Colorado. The other reason that I want to pitch native plants as an important part of Coloradoscaping today is just because of Colorado weather. I laughed so hard when I saw this Colorado weather report here. Yeah. But the nice thing about our Colorado native plants is that they're not phased by the normal amount of changes, right? We don't, like the first spring is not the first spring, you know? If you have something like a native serviceberry and a non-native apple tree that are side by side, when the first, what seems like spring, false spring comes, the apple is gonna be like, it's time, and it brings out its flowers. And the serviceberry, which is a different type of fruiting tree that's native to this area, is gonna be like, no. No, wait, like 1 more month, 2 more months, wait. And then the apple may lose its flowers and then lose its fruit, or even die because it bloomed too early, because it's just not used to the cycles of our weather here. Native plants also tend to stand up really well to things like crazy wind and hail and all the other challenges that we have in this area. And they're beautiful. So the type of plants that were growing in this area before colonization are beautiful. They also have a lot of color year-round. So when we're talking about Coloradoscapes, it doesn't have to involve all native plants. It can involve some plants that are well adapted to our area because perhaps they're from areas that are similar, right? They don't need very much water. They like the amount of heat and cold that we get here. But the really cool thing about using specifically native plants when you're creating a garden like this is that you're going to support pollinators and birds. We are not really taught this in schools, and I don't know why, but about 90% of herbivorous insects, that means insects that eat plants, about 90% of those bugs can only eat plants that they co-evolved with that are native to their same area. That's because plants don't like to be eaten, right? I can't just start chomping on this. I mean, it looks good, but no. Because over millions of years, the plants, they evolve different ways to keep themselves from being tasty to eat, right? And then bugs have to eat plants, so they specialize. Like, okay, I figured out how to adapt to this plant's defense strategy. I figured out how to change my biochemistry to match the biochemistry of this plant. But they can't do that for every plant. They don't have enough time, they don't have enough resources. It's sort of a race between plants and bugs, if that makes sense. So for example, how many of you guys have heard about the milkweed butterfly that is endangered right now? I just said milkweed butterfly. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. Big crowd. Okay, monarch butterfly. So this is a monarch caterpillar, and the monarch butterfly, when it's in its butterfly form, it can drink the nectar from any of the flowers that you have out there. However, when it is in a caterpillar form, it can only eat milkweed, which is a native wildflower, because that's what it co-evolved with, and it has all sorts of really cool adaptations that let it eat that milkweed. You know, it takes in something that's toxic from the milkweed and uses it to make itself toxic, so that if birds eat that caterpillar, they will puke it out, which birds learn very quickly, right? So it's learned how to use the defense of the milkweed plant to be its own defense. It's pretty cool. But monarch butterflies are in danger now. We are losing them at a horrifying rate because we just don't have enough milkweed flowers across the world. If you look at forest loss in the last couple hundred years, or prairie loss in the last couple hundred years, it's easy to understand why we have, why 50% of our native bees are in danger of extinction right now. Why people are saying worldwide you see headlines like insect apocalypse. It's just because there aren't, plain and simple, enough native plants for the bugs to eat. There are other factors, of course, like pesticides, but habitat loss is the big one. And the interesting thing is that, I know that you're not going to restore habitat for bears in your backyard or orcas, but you can absolutely restore habitat for butterflies. And our native pollinators and our native insects form the base rock of our entire ecosystem, right? So supporting them is supporting everybody else. Pollinators also have this cool lock and key relationship with flowers, right? So, for example, there are some flowers, some native flowers. If you're ever lying in a Colorado meadow, you might, if you sit there long enough gazing at some wildflowers, you might see some wildflowers that are like this big, and you'll see the tiniest little bee fit itself perfectly into it and then buzz away. And that's because over millions of years, this flower and this bee have evolved to become perfect fits for each other, right? Which gives both the flower and the bee an evolutionary advantage. And if you plant low water, low maintenance, native plants in your yard, you might get bees like this guy, which is a globe mallow bee who likes to take naps in our native globe mallow flowers after he's done with his pollinating work for the afternoon. Pretty cool. You're also going to get more birds in your landscape if you plant a Colorado-scape using a lot of Colorado native plants. That's because birds eat bugs, right? Especially when they're babies. They've done studies, and for chickadee parents to raise a nest of chickadee babies to term, it takes about 6,000 insects in a 6-week period. And they have to find those insects close to the nest, right? They got to fly out from a short radius to find all those insects. And the only types of plants that support a lot of insects are native plants. So that's why, by the way, we've lost 48% of our birds here in the US grasslands since 1970. It's a lot, because they don't have enough bugs to eat. Okay, so let's talk about native xeriscapes or Colorado-scapes. This presentation is going to be very practical. You know, this was my pitch part, but I'm also going to talk to you about logistics of how you do it, just like the previous presenters did. But first, I just want to tell you that creating a low maintenance, low water, beautiful Colorado-scape using native plants, that there's so many different styles of gardens that you can make, whatever fits your aesthetic. This is one of our gardens. And it's kind of, I think, typical of what people think of a Colorado-scape or a xeriscape, in that there's a lot of rock mixed in with the plants, right? And you can see space between the plants as well. The plants are very colorful, but they're also very low water and low maintenance. It could also be something like this garden, which we did by adding a lot of ground covers, grasses, ground covers, sort of like a grid of them, and then mixing flowers through them so that we get what we call a prairie matrix garden, right? So this is a very low maintenance, sort of like a prairie restoration garden, still very beautiful in its own way and even less maintenance than the previous one. I don't have any mature cactus gardens, so I asked AI to make me a picture of one, but yes, you can make a cactus garden. This is my backyard. This is my buffalo grass lawn, which, remember, I never mow or water, surrounded by some native plants, right? This is a very tidy, normal aesthetic that you can absolutely do with low water plants. And this is at the Denver Botanic Gardens. This is a Japanese garden made entirely of evergreens that are native to Colorado, right? So whatever your style is, you can find a way to create a garden like that. So let's start with site evaluation and design, because this is the first question, really, when you're getting ready to do this, is how do you look at your yard, look at your blank weedy space, and come up with a vision and a plan. So first of all, you want to talk about your needs, your desires, your family or community's needs, desires, and your intentions. You want to think about where to put paths, where to put nooks to sit in, and study the microclimates of the area. So where is there more or less water already? Where is it sunny or shady already? Drier or wetter, colder or warmer already? The plants that you already have, you can use your phone. Nowadays we have all these awesome plant ID apps to figure out what they are. Maybe you already have native plants in your yard. Maybe you have invasive weeds. You should probably know before you decide whether to keep them or kill them. As well as, our kids, pets, wildlife using your yard. What kind of soil do you have? Where is your sewer line? Don't hit that thing. And your sprinkler zones is also very useful. If you're going to be taking a space and you have a limited budget and you want to break it up into pieces, the best way to do that if you have sprinklers is by sprinkler zone. So let's say that, this is your yard and this zone, these sprinklers come off at one time and then these sprinklers come off at a different time. You want to be able to irrigate everything at once to get it going. So start with one zone at a time. I'll talk more about irrigation later and explain what I mean by that. You're also going to want to get the dimensions of your property. If you're making a sketch by hand, you might want to do something like go to Google Earth and use their measurement tool to get dimensions. You can also just measure by hand, but it can be useful to make a little sketch. This is what sketches look like when we do them. This was the first sketch I ever made after my permaculture design course for a client, and you can see I'm just marking out where is it sunnier, where is it shadier, where does she normally walk, where's the traffic, it's warmer closer to the house, it's colder further away from the house, the traffic is here, so I might want some privacy or sound blocking there. Just very basic microclimates to help you plan well. You might also want to think about things like, if you have a blank slate, where would you like to spend time? Where would you like to have a place to sit as a family, or maybe just a nook for just you to sit surrounded by flowers and read a book or meditate? Where would you like to put paths? Normally, if I want to get from here to the door and my path is like this, I'm just going to end up ignoring it and walking through the garden, right? But similarly, if it's always like right angles, maybe I won't even notice the garden because I'm just in my right angle mindset. So I think the ideal path is something that has like a little bit of curve in it, but not too much, just enough that it maybe interrupts your train of thought a little bit to notice, oh, look at that bee, right? And then you also want to think about maintenance. So have the higher maintenance areas closer to your doors, closer to the places where you go a lot, and lower maintenance areas further away. And I'm going to talk during this workshop about how to make a low maintenance area versus a higher maintenance area, and those areas might have different aesthetics. And then of course microclimates. So in dry, sunny areas, you can plant the type of plants that are native to this area, or plants that aren't native to this area but also like that same kind of microclimate. If you're really into native plants and you're wondering what to do about a shady garden, you can plant plants that are native to the foothills or the mountains. Think about if you have a shady area, you're going to need to plant plants that are used to growing in places where there are trees, right? Because those are plants that are used to shade. And generally areas that have trees have more water than we do here, because this would have been prairie without enough water to support trees. There is a limited palette of plants. There are some plants that can handle our level of water without long-term supplemental water in the shade, like creeping Colorado holly, for example, or wild strawberry. But there's a lot more plants that do want some supplemental water if they're shade tolerant. So I would say that if you're planting a shade garden, you might want to think about irrigation. However, if you're planting a sunny area, you really just need to water it to get it going, and then you can turn off the water in the long term, because the type of plants that are used to this climate, or the type of plants that were growing here before anyone was watering them, they don't need long-term supplemental water. They're used to what we've got. They just need some water to get going, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other thing when you're looking at microclimates is to think about, north side of your house is going to be colder, south side's going to be warmer, up on a slope's going to be warmer, deep in a pocket's going to be colder, right? Think about things like this. You can also use this strategically. Let's say that you want to plant a peach tree, which is non-native, but will provide you with delicious peaches. It does have that problem of tending to bloom too early because of our roller coaster climate. However, you can trick it by putting it on the north side of your house or the north side of a fence or another tree, just enough so in the spring it gets shade. And then it won't bloom as early until it starts getting sun in the late spring or early summer, if that makes sense. And then the other thing let's talk about is water harvesting. So I loved seeing Bia's swale example I thought that that was awesome. These days, it's legal to have two 50-gallon water barrels catching water here in Colorado from your gutters. You don't necessarily need them, though. You can just skip them and go straight into the ground. Catching water from your roof is really useful, especially if you have trees. So the average size roof in Denver, we have about 20,000 gallons a year coming off of your roof, out through your downspouts. And usually, quite often, that water is just shuttled like towards your driveway, and then it goes down into the street. And from there, it goes into these sewers and containment basins where 90% of it evaporates and it doesn't actually make it back into the groundwater. So the best thing that you can do is make sure that that water from your roof is getting into the ground. And you can do that by digging basins, holes, or swales, channels, or berms, hills, and I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. This is an example of an RLD garden, one of our gardens. So you can just see we're capturing water from the downspout here, and we put it into a rock river. We made it look pretty with cobblestone, bigger cobblestone around the edges, little cobblestone in the middle. And then underneath here is a channel that's deeper in the areas where there's plants so that the water is settling into those areas and irrigating the garden passively. However, if you are going to do some earthworks, you need to make sure not to send any water back towards your foundation. So if you have a foundation line visible, meaning this where the concrete meets the siding there, that's what we call the foundation line. If you can see this, you might want to raise the dirt next to your house so that the slope will move away from your house, right? If you can't see this, you might need to build some kind of rock swale to move it away if you're having a drainage problem. But the most important thing is just if you're going to be messing with the drainage in your yard, you want the course of the water to go away from your house, not towards your house. And if you're not sure about it, just turn on a hose and test it, right? You just don't want to flood your house. Okay, so as we're talking about planning, to me, the most important thing is actually forming a connection with your landscape. So I want to invite you all to close your eyes for a moment if you want, or to journal, or to think with me and ask yourself some questions. I want you to think about the place that you're interested in adapting, whether it's a yard or a weedy area, community space, or your yard. Ask yourself, what are my gut feelings about this space right now? And how would I like to feel? What would I like to do or see in this space? When I think about a nearby wilderness area that I love, maybe somewhere that I go hike, and I think about that compared to this space or my lawn, how does that feel? How does that comparison feel? When I think about how this yard might look to a butterfly or a bird, what do I notice? And when I think about how water flows through this area, what do I notice? And finally, if your yard was going to say something to you right now, what do you think it would say? Okay, now? Okay. Let's get into soil prep, the logistics. So once you have a bit of a plan, then it comes time to actually do it. So the presenters before me talked about sod removal, which is not a bad option at all, especially if you can get it free from the city. You can also, as Bia mentioned, rent a truck and do it yourself. You do have to think about what to do with the sod afterwards. If you just flip it upside down, the grass is just going to grow out of the backside unless you put clear plastic over it in the heat of summer and dry it for like months. Yeah?
Would like a biodegradable brown paper be?
It's going to, no, the grass is going to go right through that unless you have like 4 inches of wood chips on top. In which case, why even bother flipping it? Yeah, unfortunately. The other thing to think about with sod removal is just that there's probably weed seeds in the ground underneath the sod. So that doesn't necessarily give you a low maintenance palette to start with. After the sod removal, you might want to water the area and then do some other form of weed removal before you put your garden in, just so that there's fewer weeds once you do start watering the garden to let the plants get established. This is not actually my favorite method because of that. Solarization is a easier method that has to be timed very specifically, but what's cool about this is that it uses the benefits of Colorado sun to create your Colorado scape. So you take clear plastic, water the ground underneath, get it soaked, spread the clear plastic over it. You can just use painter's plastic from Home Depot, or you can use greenhouse plastic and then reuse it afterwards. Trench it or tuck it in tight, and then wait about 2 months in the heat of summer. So you can't do this in the spring or the fall, but you can do this July, August, September. And what it will do is it will fry everything underneath it. It's kind of like a magnified greenhouse effect. So everything underneath that plastic is going to bloom and grow and die. Bloom and grow and die really repeatedly over those 2 months. When you remove the plastic, what you have is a thin film of compost on the top, and all of the seeds in the top 2 inches of your ground there are going to be dead. Right? So this is a really great way to prep an area for seeding if you're doing seeding. It does have ecological downsides, but every single one of these do. Every single one of these methods do. Sheet mulching and smothering is another great method, very popular in the permaculture community. So you mow your lawn, you put down newspaper or cardboard, you put wood chips on top of it. If you're building a veggie garden bed, you might want to do layers of compost and wood chips or something like that to make it really rich and humusy, but not if you're doing a low water garden, because it doesn't like environments like that. This can work quite well. It doesn't work so great on lawns specifically because lawns, Kentucky bluegrass is just really strong. So unless you have 4 inches of wood chips like this, the grass is just going to grow straight through it. It doesn't work very well. Yeah?
The grass will go straight through it even if you put like thick cardboard on top?
In my experience, yes. Yeah, unless you have about thick cardboard and 4 inches of wood chips. Yeah, it's better than without it, for sure. It's also a lot of work to do this, particularly if you have a big space. It's a lot of work. But it does work. It is a good method. There's a lot of other methods. I asked AI to make this image for me yesterday. So you can smother it with black plastic over about a 6-month period and then remove it for 1 week out of every month. What that will do is continuously bring up new rounds of weeds that are waiting underneath the surface and then kill them. Bring them up, kill them, bring them up, kill them. You can pour boiling water or use a flamethrower on your weeds. I really had a client use a flamethrower. I thought that was great. Of course, you can weed by hand, but you have to be, with all these methods, you really want to do multiple rounds. You want to plan some time before you're going to plant the garden, because as soon as you start really watering your garden with those new plants, all those waiting weeds are going to come up. And it's so much easier to attack them all at the beginning than to try to weed in between your desired plants afterwards. It's a lot easier. And of course, I have to talk about herbicide. So I'm an ecological landscaper, so when I started my business, I was like, I'm never going to use herbicide, and I spent a whole year using all these other methods. And then many people who have been doing this for longer than me kept telling me, you know, herbicide is a tool in the toolbox, and there is a time to use that tool, right? So herbicide, and specifically glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, has a very negative reputation that is very well deserved in our society, because agricultural companies spray it on all of our food to kill weeds, and they grow plants that are resistant to the chemical, but then we eat it, and glyphosate is very bad for our bodies, okay? The way that it's used in our society is really unconscionable. However, habitat restoration professionals and ecological landscapers do use glyphosate for what I would say is its best possible purpose. Part of why glyphosate is so overused is because it's very gentle. Sort of think of it as like an over-the-counter herbicide, right? It's gentle because the soil actually breaks it down. So the bacteria in the soil eats the glyphosate and breaks it down somewhere between 3 weeks and a year, and it's gone. And it doesn't spread or leach into other plants or into other waterways. As soon as it dries, it sticks there. So this is the High Plains Environmental Center in Loveland, which has native plant demonstration gardens that are not irrigated. You should go look at them. They're gorgeous. And they have areas that were covered in invasive plants. They sprayed them with glyphosate. They planted native plants, and now they're buzzing with bees and birds, right? So you can think of it kind of like chemotherapy or antibiotics. There is a time and a place where this might be the right strategy for you. It's cheap, it's easy, it wipes out the bad to make room for the good. If you're going to spray glyphosate, I would suggest having a process about it, because for some people, it's kind of an intense thing to think about doing, to buy 41% glyphosate on Amazon instead of supporting Roundup, instead of supporting Monsanto, and don't get it on your skin. Don't spray it on a windy day where it can go weird places. Don't spray it near flowing water. If you spray it on a day where you've got flowers in bloom in your lawn, like little dandelion flowers, I would pick all those dandelions first so that the bees don't land on it when the chemical is still wet. Glyphosate is considered non-toxic to touch after it dries, so after about 24 hours. But for those first 24 hours, you don't want to walk on it, you don't want your pets to walk on it, you want to put up a little sign, and ideally you want to keep bees from landing on that area during those 24 hours by not having tempting flowers for them. Then you have to wait about 2 weeks before it kills your grass or it kills your weeds. It's a slow death as the chemical works down into the roots. Okay, I'm going to talk about picking and sourcing plants when we come back after a 5-minute break, 11-minute break. Somebody asked me a question during the break that reminded me I forgot to tell you one thing about the glyphosate option, which is important to tell you. One nice thing about the glyphosate option is if you spray your lawn, you can then just leave the dead turf, and it acts like a temporary weed barrier. You can plant straight into it, if that makes sense. It will actually, you'll have fewer weeds then, because the dead turf will sort of keep new weeds from coming up. So you don't need to do both glyphosate and sod removal. You can just do one or the other. Okay, I am going to talk to you a bit about, I feel like I'm echoing weirdly and I don't know why. Is it me?
Let me just take this one.
Maybe it's that. Turn it down just a little bit.
Okay. How's that? You guys can hear me? Okay, great. So I want to talk to you a little bit about picking and sourcing plants. That's probably the next step once you have a general plan and you figured out how you're going to kill your weeds or your grass to prepare the space, is where do you get plants? So Garden in a Box is a great resource. It's already been mentioned. They do also say what percentage of the plants are native, which I think is great in each Garden in the Box. There are other ways to get plants, though, your local nurseries. I have a Garden in a Truck program I might tell you guys a little bit about. And if you just want to get a sense of like, what does a low water native wildflower look like? This is my website, and here under resources, I have a bunch of free DIY resources. This is a native plant lookbook I made full of pictures of some of my favorite native wildflowers that we're growing here in the Denver area and that like dry, sunny microclimates that don't need long-term supplemental water. This is probably my favorite native plant ever, little blue stem. It turns red in winter. Super pretty. Say that again?
What's your website?
It's restorative-landscape-design.com. Yeah. And then the second half of it has shady wildflowers that are native to the mountains or the foothills and can tolerate partial or full shade and are also good for pollinators and birds here in Colorado. So here's just, to kind of whet your palate. If you're thinking native plants and all that's coming to mind is brown grasses, here's some cool options. On this page on my website, there's a link here to the public Colorado native plants spreadsheet. This is a public resource that you can help me with if you want to help me build it up. I have compiled, okay, this is every native plant used for commercial landscaping purposes that you can buy around here, and all the information that I have about it. I'm continuously adding to it, but basically, like let's say you go down here to flowers, you could click on common milkweed, and it has the Latin name, the size, the bloom color, what type of microclimate it likes in the Denver area, so dry sun. When it blooms, is it a long-lived or a short-lived plant? Is it native to Colorado or nearby areas? How much does it spread? Ethnobotany, how did Native Americans use this plant? Wildlife value, what is it a host plant to? If you right-click on any cell and you make a comment, then I will get an email about it and I will incorporate it if you want to help me add to it that way. I'm also always looking for volunteers to help me flesh it out with some good hours. But this is a really great resource if you want to source the plants yourself from local nurseries and you're wondering, what's native and how do I put together a plant mix where I have something blooming in every season and plants that are gonna work well together. So those are some free resources for you. Oh, well, no. Yeah, I think I'll show you one more thing actually before I leave. The website, also if you go to resources, down to resource directory on my website, this is lists of where to get native plants and seeds. High Plains Environmental Center in Loveland is my favorite place. Obviously the Garden in a Box program was already mentioned. I have a native garden in a truck service that's, if you want to buy like over $500 worth of plants, you want hundreds of plants, you want thousands of plants, you can tell me about your yard and I will pick them all for you, and it'll be a very well arranged mix, and then we'll deliver them to you in a truck at wholesale prices. Western Native Seed is an awesome place to get seeds, and here are two lists by my favorite local nonprofits. Well, two of my favorite local nonprofits. I love Audubon Society and Colorado Wildlife Federation as well. There's a whole group of Colorado nonprofits that we call the Colorado Native Plant Landscaping Coalition, and they're awesome. Two of those are Wild Ones Front Range and the Colorado Native Plant Society, and they both have lists of every place we know of in Colorado where you can buy native plants. And again, you don't have to plant all native for it to be a Colorado scape, but certainly doesn't hurt. So when you're picking plants, of course you want to match the microclimates. You want to think about, if I pick the right plant for this dry, sunny area, it won't need any long-term irrigation or fertilization for me. So you want to pick the right plant for the right microclimate. You can use my spreadsheet for that if you're wondering. I would suggest that you limit the species if there's any way that people are going to see your landscape and it's not like just a backyard where you want as much bee activity as possible. Especially if it's something like a front yard, stick to say 3 flowers that bloom in spring, 3 that bloom in summer, 3 that bloom in fall, and then have repeated groups of those through your yard. What that's going to do is create a garden that looks purposeful, looks orderly, looks artistic, looks like a human had a hand in creating some beauty instead of just like a wild mess. And of course, you definitely do want to pay attention to seasonal interest. You want to have things blooming at different times of the year. You want to have a lot of ground covers that will help make it lower maintenance, as well as some things that are taller, textured, give you winter interest. And in general, I would suggest staying away from tons of tall plants or really aggressive plants, because as we're creating these Colorado scapes, we want to have good relationships with our neighbors. We want our neighbors to walk by and say like, oh, that looks great. Maybe I'll convert my lawn, instead of like, whoa, right? Yeah. I would also suggest there are what we call pioneer plants, and climax species is one way we talk about it when we're talking about forests. Another way of saying it is that there are some long-lived plants and that there are plants that don't live so long. They're annuals or biannuals or short-lived perennials, and they reseed themselves. That's their growth strategy. You want to have a mix of both so that you have some blooms and some color in the first couple of years. Bia mentioned in the native plant community, we say first year they sleep, second year they creep, third year they leap. your garden is really going to, whether you're using native plants or just the types of plants that are acclimated to these low water conditions, most of those plants are long-lived plants that spend the first couple years of their lives focusing on root growth because they don't know what's coming. They're like, I know Colorado, we could hit some major drought at any moment. So I'm not going to invest in flowers until I am well stabilized in the soil, which just means your garden's not very showy in the first couple of years, unless you mix in some annuals, biannuals, short-lived perennials. Also, if you're really interested in things like plants for specific purposes, like for birds, for food, for medicine, for specialist bees that are native to Colorado, things like that, there are lists on my website in that resource directory that can help you with that. I want to give you an example really quick of what I'm talking about when I say short-lived fillers. So this is a HOA in Lafayette where we converted a huge section of their park into a Colorado-scape. And this was day one. All the plants we planted were like this small, which made them really cheap. I got them wholesale for like $2 a plant, but it's not much to look at. However, 2 months later, it was already really coming along, and that's because we mixed in some of those short-lived plants. We're about 1 year in now. They saved 300,000 gallons of water last year, which is about $8,000 in water, just on this 3,000 square foot garden that we converted from turf to this. This is still not how good it's going to look because this is only year one. In year 3, it's going to look much better, but it already looks like interesting, at least. It's a little wild, but it's interesting because we've got those more shorter-lived plants. Yeah?
Can you tell us about the irrigation or lack of irrigation for this site?
I will. Also, if you're really into edibles, there are so many amazing native plants that have edible and medicinal uses. Native Americans have been harvesting and using and cultivating relationships with the native plants here for so many years, and there tends to be a tendency to think of, when you think of edible plants, we think of mostly things that got carried over by immigrants from Europe. So, you might think about apples, or you might think about when you think of medicinal plants, you might think about lemon balm or something like that, right? But actually, for all of the edible uses and medicinal uses and tea uses that are well known in our culture, there are parallels found in native plants. If that makes sense. So that's definitely worth looking into if you're interested in that. We even have a lot of cool native fruit trees. So just to reiterate, I have a garden in a truck program where I will pick all the plants for you after you answer a questionnaire telling me about your yard. That's a really easy way to do it. Another easy way to do it is to get a garden in a box from Resource Central. Harlequin's Gardens in Boulder and High Plains Environmental Center in Loveland are probably my favorite retail places to buy native plants. Again, how native is native enough? A Colorado scape, I'm not saying that it has to be 100% native, but if you're like me and you're really excited about supporting those pollinators and birds and having that be one of the main benefits of your Colorado scape, as well as just sort of recreating a natural Colorado habitat, you can learn about the plants that are already in your yard or the plants that you're interested in planting by going to the BONAP website and looking up the plant you're interested in by the Latin name, and it will show you where it's native to in the United States. So for example, this is prairie wine cups. You can see it's native to this whole green area. It includes Colorado, but I can see that it also grows in New Mexico and Texas, which tells me it's probably a good bet to plant here because climate forecasts suggest that by 2050 or 2080, our climate is going to look a lot like New Mexico and Texas. Growing from seed is a really great way to do this on a budget. It is difficult to grow a meadow of mixed flower and grass seeds unless you solarize, because if you just throw it out, then the seeds will grow up, but so will a bunch of weeds, and you won't be able to tell what is what. So it's probably not going to work very well. However, if you solarize, remember that will kill all the weed seeds in the top 2 inches. So then you could do that. You could do a wildflower meadow from seed, and it would look like my friend Jonathan's front yard in Centennial. That's what he did, solarized, sprinkled wildflower and grass seeds. This is not everyone's aesthetic. I think it's amazing, but not everybody's going to love it, but it's definitely an option. The other thing is grass is much easier to do from seed, particularly because you can use selective herbicides, and there are some non-toxic selective herbicide options like mesotrione and corn gluten. I talk about this in the DIY guide ebook that's available on my website. What that means is basically like you can sprinkle some granules with the seeds and it will keep weeds from coming up. So only the grass will come up. But if you sprinkle both wildflowers seeds and grass seeds along with those granules, it won't work because it will keep the flowers from growing up too. That makes sense. But you can use this. In my yard, I established a buffalo grass lawn, and now I'm going through it and planting flowers straight into it while the buffalo grass lawn keeps it low maintenance, so that's also an option. If you have a really large area of land, you can try seeding and repeating mowing to keep the annual weeds from taking over while the perennials are staying small, but that's a strategy that I would definitely recommend consultation for. In general, I think that growing from plants is a better bet. It tends to look tidier. You're probably going to have better relationships with your neighbors. It's probably going to be more successful, but it definitely costs a lot more to buy each plant as a little baby plant. Okay, so once you've figured out some of the plants that you want, the next thing to figure out is how dense do you want your garden? So oftentimes when we see or talk about Colorado scapes, they may look something like this. This is one of the gardens we did at 2-foot density, which means that there's about 1 plant every 2 square feet. What's cool about gardens like this is that you can see the full shape of every plant and that it looks very tidy, but you also have to keep weeding the areas in between the plants when it's not so dense. So 2 to 3 foot density, it's definitely a lot cheaper than a more dense planting, right? Because this is already a lot of plants to buy. Just imagine if you buy twice as many plants, that's twice the cost. But again, the areas in between the plants, even if you mulch them, eventually you're still going to have to weed those areas because nature just wants to cover everything in plants, right? Nature fills everything with horizontal and vertical density. It says, I'm going to get as many sedges and flowers as I can into this landscape. I'm going to have trees and vines and bushes and medium-sized plants and ground covers. Every single place where sunlight can reach, where nutrients can be accessed, a plant is going to try to grow, right? So one thing you want to think about when you're making your plan is what kind of density do you want? If you can go more dense and have a plant every 1/2 foot or every 1.5 feet, that provides fewer spaces where weeds can move in. This is a RLD garden we did 3 years ago. It's really starting to look beautiful now. I'm happy with it. Also, the more grasses and ground covers that you use, the lower maintenance it will be. Anything that's like there year round. And besides thinking about density, you also want to think about how you're going to range the plants. That also affects the maintenance in the long term. So a normal plant garden, we use a strategy that we call massing, meaning we plant in groups. Here's a big group of sulfur flower. There's another group of sulfur flower in the back. You have a group of flowers, and then maybe a group of ornamental grasses, and then a group of another flowers. And if you do that densely, it's pretty low maintenance. Here's the High Plains Environmental Center. Oh, this was Kendrick Lake. Whoop. High Plains Environmental Center. More High Plains Environmental Center. You can also do this with sedges in a shady area, or wild strawberry, pussy toes, other types of ground covers. And I feel like I missed saying something. Hold on a second. Oh, I know what I was going to say. What I was going to say about this picture actually is instead of doing it just like a group of flowers and then a group of grasses, if you mix them together, so it's a mix of grass flower, like a scrambled egg situation, right? Or in a shady area, sedge flower, or pussy toes flower. If you mix your ground covers and grasses together, it's going to look more like a meadow and a prairie, and it's also going to be lower maintenance because that's how nature does it. It mixes the ground covers and the flowers together. The other thing that's nice about mixing ground covers and flowers together and having a lot of ground covers is that the ground covers look cool in winter, and then your garden doesn't just totally disappear like it does if all you do is flowers. You get color, you get texture in winter. So there's mixing them together, there's grouping them, that affects the maintenance. How dense you plant, that affects the maintenance. Mulches is something else that affects the maintenance. Most people are familiar with this, what you put in between the plants. So if you don't have the budget to do a really dense planting with a ton of plants, and you want to get fewer plants and space them out, for example, the Garden in a Box program I think is about 2.5 feet per plant, which is, that's a lot of space in between the plants, then you might want to get a mulch that's going to be there in the long term. Because if you put wood mulch down, you have to replace it every year or two. It degrades, it goes away, right? Eventually those plants might spread, but it may take a while when they're so spaced out. So I really like chip rock. Chip rock it's about the size of pea gravel, but it has rough edges. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen pea gravel like rolling out of a garden onto a sidewalk, right? It tends to roll around. Chip rock doesn't do that. It knits together like this. But it's a lot better than big pieces of gravel. How many of us have dealt with a garden where you've got these big pieces of gravel like this, and then the dirt and the weed seeds just blow in between the cracks and grow on top of it? Yeah, it's really, really annoying. If you pick a smaller diameter gravel for the mulch, like pea gravel or chip rock, the smaller the better, then there's fewer cracks. There's fewer big cracks. It's harder for weeds and dirt to get in there. And you never have to replace it once you put it down once. This is Depot Prairie Park in Englewood. They use chip rock as a mulch around the plants, and it is working great. This is all native plant garden. You can go see in Englewood if you'd like to. I also use wood mulch quite a lot, but I usually use it with dense plantings. So let's say I have one plant every 1.5 feet. I then know that once the plants reach their full size, they're going to be touching each other, and there's not going to be so much room for weeds to grow in between the plants. So in a situation like that, I'm not worried about a mulch that's long-term, and wood mulch is cheap and easy and fast. So that's what I will usually use just as a temporary mulch to help keep the weeds down while the plants are still small and there's still more opportunities for weeds to move in. In the long term, what you want to see with a dense planting is a green mulch, meaning a dense matrix of grasses or ground covers. It doesn't have to be primarily grasses like this prairie garden at Botanic Gardens, but the more grasses you have, the more ground covers that you have, the lower maintenance it will be. You can even do this with buffalo grass and tiny little flowers if you want. If you mix flowers and grasses, it will be lower maintenance than just flowers or just grasses, because that's how nature does it, right? Even under the soil, grasses tend to have these fibrous network roots, and then the flowers have these deep tap roots. Above the soil, they have different growth patterns. They work together, flowers and grasses, so that they use all the available space in the soil and all the available sunlight that there is, and that doesn't leave much room for weeds. So anytime you're mixing grasses and flowers together, it's going to be the lowest maintenance option ever. We already did the break, so I can skip that. The other thing that will make it low maintenance is using a weed barrier. Most people use these plastic weed barriers. How many people have regretted the fact that either you or someone before you used a plastic weed barrier? That's a lot of hands. Okay, so the plastic weed barrier is great at first because it keeps weeds from growing out while you're watering your new garden. But in the long term, the mulch disappears and you can see it. Weed seeds blow in and grow on top of it. Those roots get tangled in the fabric. You try to pull them out and they won't pull out, and then you pull out the flower you didn't want to pull out. It's just a nightmare. Plus, most of our native bees overwinter in the soil. Actually, so many pollinators need access to bare soil, and they can't get it if we cover everything in plastic. Not to mention, plastic. So what I like to use is biodegradable weed barriers. Now, cardboard is the most well-known one. Cardboard, I do not like working with cardboard because it's really hard. Like, have you ever tried to cut a square out of cardboard? Imagine you have 300 plants and you're doing that 300 times. Like, it's a bitch. So what I like to do is go to Home Depot, go to the paint aisle, and you'll see these big rolls of recycled paper and big rolls of recycled cardboard. My favorite is the recycled cardboard. It's called X-board. Recycled paper is called builder paper. Either way, Go to Home Depot, go to the paint aisle, you just roll it out, you stake it down, you cut holes in it super easily and fast with a little X-Acto knife, and then you plant straight into it. What that will do is keep weeds from growing up in between your plants while you're watering them. You might be able to skip this if, by the way, if you have a really good solid turf, like you've got sod, and then you spray kill it and then you plant straight into it, because that kind of works like a biodegradable weed barrier, as I mentioned. But this is really, really important, I would say. It'll make it much lower maintenance for you in the long term, particularly in like open weedy areas. You can also use newspaper, but it's hard to find newspaper nowadays. Like you have to find a little old lady who's been collecting it, and then somehow is also on Nextdoor answering your query. So you don't usually need amendments for low water plants, for Colorado scape type plants, for native plants. That's because, think about a prairie plant. Like a prairie plant is not used to rich humusy soil. It doesn't have big trees growing and falling and rivers running and bears dying with fruit still in their mouth and all of these things that create rich humusy, composty soil. So our native plants are actually used to very low nutrient environments, and they're used to shitty clay, which is what we have. We've got plenty of shitty clay to keep them happy. So you don't usually need to amend the soil. You don't need to till the soil. That's just going to bring up a lot more weeds. If you do want to kind of give each plant like the best possible treatment, I would say mix a little bit of compost, like 5% or less of the whole, and a little bit of pea gravel, like 10%, into your planting hole. Maybe some mycorrhizals too, if you're really into soil science. Yeah. That would probably be the ideal planting mix for your native plants, but they don't really need it. They'll be okay no matter how crappy your soil is. If you're not sure about that, you think you might have something unusual going on, you can do a jar test. Just Google that. You can do a soil test through someone like CSU. If you live on a house that's like a more recent development and everything was like bulldozed and compacted and now it's just absolute rock, that's a situation where you probably need to do something to open up the soil a little bit, which could be as simple as, opening it up here and there with a broad fork and mixing in some of these things, like compost and pea gravel. Okay, so you've got your plants, you figured out how to make it lower maintenance. Irrigation is the next big question. Now, my favorite thing to do, and what I most frequently advise people to do, is pick the right plants for the right spots and then don't irrigate them in the long term. Because if you don't irrigate it in the long term, you're going to have fewer weeds. It's going to be lower maintenance, and our native plants, they really don't need it. Like I said, they were growing here before anyone was watering them. They're fine. They do need water to get going at the beginning. Yeah, and I will talk to you about how often I would suggest watering them to get going at the beginning. However, if you want your plants to be optimally lush and gorgeous as much as they can all year, then irrigation is a good idea. Just keep in mind that you will have to weed a bit more. And in that case, I would suggest you're going to water like once a week or once every 2 weeks for a long period of time, maximum. So this is going to be a very different watering schedule than something like a veggie garden. If you have sprinklers, great. You can use your sprinklers to establish the plants. This is another reason why it's good to know where your zones are, because if you're converting a whole yard into a garden area and you want to do it in phases and you have sprinklers, just use your sprinklers to establish one zone's worth of plants, and then later on, another year when you have time, you can do the same thing in another area, if that makes sense. Think of your zones as already carving up your yard for you. If you want to have long-term irrigation, then you can either raise your sprinklers by getting higher pop-ups, so they come up more like a foot, and that will make it easier for them to get over the grasses and the flowers, right? And you might want to switch to low water pop-ups if you don't have them. They're the fingers, right? The old sprinklers were either the rotors, which are like, you hear them in the parks, or they're the sprays that just give like a full curtain of water. And the low water ones, if you haven't seen them, are like these fingers that just put a little bit of water at a time and take longer to go. They're more efficient, so you might want to switch to those low water pop-ups. The other option is you can switch to drip irrigation. Even if you don't have sprinklers, you can tap into your hose spigot and set up a drip irrigation system. Somebody asked me what type of irrigation we use at that HOA project. This picture is actually from that HOA project. So we spray killed the grass with glyphosate, and now we're laying down Netafim. So Netafim is drip irrigation that already has emitter holes inside of it. It has a hole at it depends on the distance. So you can get it like 1.5 feet or every foot. But if you're gonna do a dense planting, this works really well because you just snake it out in these lines, and then you just plant a plant at every hole already. And then you don't have to add the little emitters and the spaghetti hose and mess with all of that stuff. So if you're doing a dense planting, Netafim is a great idea, also known as Techline. If you're not doing a dense planting, then this stuff doesn't come in like 1 hole every 3 feet density. So then you probably want to do the normal drip irrigation where you have a 1/2-inch tube and then you have an emitter coming off of it, and then you have a little spaghetti tube going to your individual plant. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's beyond the scope of this workshop, but just YouTube it, go to Home Depot, talk to some guy in the aisle, you'll figure it out. And the other thing to think about when you're thinking about irrigation is, how can I use the water that's already here? How can I use the water coming off of my roof, for example, to create areas that are higher water for things that may want more water? Like maybe I'm really into our state flower, blue columbine. That wants a little bit more water than can be found at the prairie because it's a mountain flower. But if you plant it near a downspout, it'll do just fine. Same thing with a tree. I'm not going to talk much about like creating paths and nooks and edging and things like that because that's beyond the scope of this workshop. But I do want to talk a little bit about grass species. Someone asked me about this during the break as well. My favorite is buffalo grass because you don't have to mow it or water it in the long term. It's so short. The one thing about buffalo grass is that it does not stand up easily to dog urine or really, really heavy and frequent traffic, like kids and dogs roughhousing in the same spot every day, or a dog who has the zoomies in front of the fence in the exact same spot. But there is a species of grass that's like buffalo grass called dog tuft grass from Africa that can handle dog urine and heavy and frequent traffic. It is very similar to buffalo grass in that it's well acclimated for our climate. You don't have to water it in the long term, and you don't have to mow it in the long term. It only gets 6 inches and then it stops. I think I have pictures. Here's a dog tuft RLD transformation. Buffalo grass and dog tuft, one thing I want to mention, here's my backyard again, which looks so beautiful because my boyfriend still has not created the gate, the fence in the back. But what I want to emphasize here is the buffalo grass is a warm season grass. And that means you can see this picture was taken last fall. And it turns brown about mid-September, and then it stays brown till mid-May. So it's different than Kentucky bluegrass. It likes it when it's hot. It likes the heat. Doesn't like it when it's cold. It goes dormant. It's still alive, but it's brown. So if you're going to use, if you have a sunny area and you want to use buffalo grass or dog tuft grass, you have to make that adjustment in your mind that it's not going to be green year-round. Same goes for blue grama, which is actually the #1 plant that was growing in Denver and is part of their seed mix here. Is an amazing, amazing lawn grass, but that one you may want to mow because it can get up to like 1 foot or 2 high. So I would not call it no mow unless you are just creating sort of like a wild, low maintenance backyard area for your dogs and kids to romp around in. But I wouldn't call it a lawn. If you have a part shade area, we have some native fine fescues as well as non-native fine fescues that can handle part shade but are lower water than Kentucky bluegrass, which is the typical lawn grass that people use. I'm a really big fan of sheep fescue. This is not native, unfortunately, but it's also, I'm a very lazy person, so the reason I'm a big fan of it is it only gets about 6 inches tall and then it stops growing. So this is a client of mine this year. This was just dirt and they seeded sheep fescue and it came in and this is how it looks. Looks great. Doesn't require as much water and doesn't require as much maintenance as regular grass. In the full shade, you might want to consider a tall fescue grass if you're looking for something that's a little less water than Kentucky bluegrass. Sheep fescue, and by the way, is green year-round, but the blue grama, buffalo grass, dogtuff are not. The other thing I would like you guys to think about when you're planning out your space is creating habitat. So the majority of our native bees actually nest in bare ground, so they need access to bare soil, but a lot of them nest in dead wood. So if you just if you leave a stump in your backyard, if you find a cool log when you're out in the forest and you drag it into your backyard, that creates more habitat for pollinators. And really anything that you can do to add diversity to your terrain is going to be good for our native insects and therefore good for our native birds as well. Because we have a lot of native pollinators who have like really specific overwintering requirements. Like there's this bee that will only overwinter in sandy soil right next to a rock. You know, that's what it wants. So in a situation like that, where my mind goes is let's just get as much diversity in your terrain as possible. Make different types of soil, different types of slope, different types of natural debris, rocks, logs, things like that. Rocks definitely provide awesome habitat. I'm really obsessed with crevice gardening right now. This is one of our projects that started to come along. Crevice gardening is where you take a bunch of small rocks and you arrange them so it looks like they were once part of a bigger rock. And then you plant little plants in between them. And little bugs and lizards and stuff like that can hang out there as well. Super, super cool. You might also want to consider a bird bubbler or a water feature. There's information about a low maintenance bird bubbler on my website if you want to go learn about that. Something that will draw both local and migratory birds. And finally, think about your timeline. So if you're just going to be watering the plants to get them going and then you're not going to give them long-term irrigation, I would highly suggest doing the planting in the spring or the fall because that's going to be a lot easier in terms of how often you have to water during that first 3 months while they're establishing. However, if you already have sprinklers, you already have automatic irrigation, you have some shade, you can establish these types of plants in the middle of summer. They just need some extra water. I plant through late April through early November. And finally, installation. Okay, so when it comes time to, so I'm a landscaper, you know, we can come and do stuff for you if you live in my area. We also have a cool DIY with Help project, which is sort of like a village barn raising sort of program where you pay people $25 an hour at the end of the day and they just come help you plant stuff. If you're doing it yourself, there are things to think about, including where do you get the stuff? So in Google Maps, put in landscape supply and it will send you, you'll find places like Bedrock and Ewing. These landscape supply places have giant piles of mulch, giant piles of dirt, rock, etc. You can rent a truck, borrow a truck, use a truck, or have them deliver it for you. Earthworks, so this is the swales and basins I was talking about. So I would start with this before you plant. You want to do all the moving around of soil before you get into planting, right? This is a project where there were 3 downspouts coming out of the neighbor's side and then 2 out of our client's side, so 5 downspouts pouring in between the house foundations right there. Terrible idea, and definitely not watering anything there. So what we did is we dug a channel, and then, you can see this was my plan, we dug a channel and then we filled it with rocks, so it looked like a rock river, and it kind of looks like the water just pours out onto the sidewalk, but what we did was we dug a hidden basin in the middle so that the water actually seeps there. You can't see it at the end, but the water is actually seeping into the hillside and then watering all those plants on the hillside. And you can fill your basin with grass clippings, logs, twigs, anything like that. It will break down and add nutrients to the soil and you have to keep adding new stuff in, or you can just fill it with rocks and then you never have to do anything else to it. But Swales that lead to basins are really great ways of keeping water on a hillside, and they're really great ways of watering trees. If you have a tree in your landscape, do like what Bia did. Send the water from your downspout to that tree. It will thank you so much. You can make the swales look like paths if you make them wide and make them of smaller rocks so you can walk on them. You can use all sorts of different colors of flagstone to make them look different ways. Have fun with it. If you don't want to make a swale, you could also consider a berm. Basically, a swale is like a channel or a hole in the ground where the water seeps in, and then the berm is the other side of the cup. So if you want to capture water, you need to either dig out the bottom side or build up the side of the cup, right? So if you don't want to dig a hole, then just put some dirt on the downhill side. It can be like a ridge, if that makes sense, and then the water will come down your slope and then hit the ridge and will sink into the ground before it keeps going. This is a way of keeping the water on your property if you put a berm downhill of where you want the water to sink in. After you've done your earthworks, then you want to do your irrigation or your X-board or newspaper. The exact order of this kind of depends on exactly the strategies that you're using, but this is what I was talking about, where we took builder paper and we rolled it out and we staked it down, and we laid out the plants, cut holes for the plants, planted them. If you're using newspaper, you can plant the plants first and then put the newspaper around it. And then arranging your plants. I am running out of time, so I'm speeding up a little bit in case you guys haven't noticed. When you're arranging your plants, so let's say you've got all these plants and you know something about them, like you know which ones are taller and which ones are shorter because it says it on the tag or whatever, but you don't know how to arrange them through the space. I would start with anything that's going to be really big and eye-catching throughout the year, like a bush or a tree, and lay that out first, thinking about how it will draw your eye through the space in the winter when there's not much else going on. If there's any really eye-catching plants, like these cool guys at Kendrick Lake Park, you might want to lay those out first as well. And then if you're going to use a lot of ground covers and you're going to do a matrix garden, I would lay the ground covers out first. So here, each X is a grass, right? So you lay the grasses out in a grid, and then you put the flowers through that grid. That's probably the lowest maintenance way to make a garden. So just to show you what that looks like, we use that Netafim stuff I was telling you about, the hosing that already has holes in it, low water holes in it. And then you just put one plant at each hole. So you basically end up with sort of a grid of plants. And you can either use the massing strategy where you have a group of flowers and then a group of ornamental grasses and then a group of flowers. Or you can use the matrix scrambled egg strategy and go grass, flower, grass, flower, grass, flower. In nature, you'll notice there are groups and drifts like this. Your eye will travel through a space following natural patterns. Oh, sorry, I said that backwards. I wanted to talk next about groups and drifts. So once you have your ground covers laid out, or if you're not doing the ground cover matrix and you just want to do groups of flowers, grasses, I would think about putting the flowers in groups. What I mean is, like, let's say that I have 10 of these yellow guys. Maybe instead of sprinkling those 10 equally through the space, I'll put 3 over here and 3 over here and 3 over there. That's how that's sort of like a natural pattern that you'll see in nature through these groups. Here's a drawing where you can sort of see what I'm talking about. Like this green splotch, this is all one plant that repeats through the space. What happens then is when that plant is blooming, your eye will be drawn through the space, right? Through the whole space. It also makes it easier for pollinators to see them, and it makes more of an impression on you when they bloom all in a group. So if you're not doing a matrix planting, it might look something like this. Notice the sulfur flower here, and then how you see it in the back repeated here at Kendrick Lake Park. If you are using a matrix, this is High Plains Environmental Center again, you'll still see groups of flowers, even though they may be planted into or surrounded by a lot of grasses or ground covers. Even if you have a very small garden, I would still encourage you to plant in groups. Like let's say you just have 3 Rocky Mountain penstemons, put them together instead of scattering them. That way when they bloom, you'll be like, whoa, check you out, Rocky Mountain penstemon. And again, if you want to use that matrix strategy, put the ground covers down first and then just create groups through them. Like these yellow squiggles is like a drift of plants, and those red circles are 2 different groups of plants in this example. So in this matrix garden that we designed, you can see how there's sort of like a group of gay butterfly milkweed there, a group of scarlet bugler penstemon in the back, and they drift through this space. And then if you have any of those short-lived dynamic fillers like annuals, you might want to sprinkle them throughout the whole space while everything else is filling in. When it comes time to planting, I'd really encourage you to try to mess up the roots or get some of the soil off so that the roots just like don't keep growing in circles like this, like they were in the pot. Our native plants, you can even shake off all of the soil and then plant it bare root in there and get those roots as deep in there as they can, and the plant will love it because they're used to our native soil and the roots are not really supposed to grow in little circles like that. I would suggest if you use our garden in a truck program or you order flats of plants online or any kind of situation where you have a lot of small plants, you might want to invest in a garden auger, which is this cool little drill bit thing you can get off Amazon for like 20 bucks, and you just go and make the holes like that. It's so much easier than digging each individual hole. However, if you have really bigger plants, like 1-gallon plants or 4-inch plants, then you would need something like what we use. This is Xena Warrior Princess, not my helper Wasu in there. That's what we call the machine. And that's an $800 tool, so that's probably outside of your budget, but if you are planting bigger plants, you might want to invest in a hori hori. This is only $20, $25. It's a Japanese digging knife. It's going to make it a lot easier for you to dig by hand into the soil. Then it's time to mulch. I highly suggest mulching in little piles in between the plants and then smoothing them. And time to celebrate. Yeah. I want to talk for just a minute about maintenance and what to expect in the long term. So if you're creating a natural garden and you're going for something that is more natural and low maintenance, you can expect that the plants will move around and find where they want to be, that the garden will look different in different seasons, it'll look different when it's drier versus it's wetter, that it will take some time to fully grow to maturity, and that the weeding will be more intensive at the beginning, but if you design a low maintenance garden, it won't be very much maintenance at all in the long term. You basically just need to keep an eye on it. If you're going to water, I would say basically at the beginning you want to water like once a day for the first week or 2, and then you can start cutting back to 2 or 3 times a week and then once a week over about a 3-month period, and that should be enough for your garden to fully establish if you pick the right plants for the right places. However, if you want to irrigate in the long term, then I would suggest something like deep watering every 2 weeks, because our native plants really like occasional deep watering so that they grow those deep roots and then completely drying out in between. That's what they like in the long term. In the first year, you might need to give it some water in the winter, just like once a month to keep the roots from completely desiccating. And in the very, very long term, if you're not watering at all, and we have like a really intense multi-month, like no water all summer, you might want to go out there with a hose to help it out once a month or at a minimum once a summer so that the plants don't all die, right? I can't say with certainty that like after 3 months you will never have to water again, because Colorado can be crazy and we don't know what types of years we might have and how little water we might have. But I can say that it should be very low maintenance. You don't want to overwater. This is a client of mine who accidentally overwatered his garden. He was thrilled with it. I was not. But that Maximilian sunflower does look pretty gorgeous. And then the other thing I want to mention about maintenance is that a lot of maintenance companies will cut everything back in the fall. And that is an issue for our native birds, which need seeds over the winter, and for our native pollinators who may be nesting in or around those areas. So we know, many of you probably know that caterpillars will often nest in leaf litter underneath trees. And when you sweep up and throw away your leaves, you're throwing away caterpillar bodies. Well, another cool thing is that little bees will sometimes overwinter in the stems of like woody, pithy flowers. So if you cut those back early in the fall and then you like throw them away, you might be throwing away little bee babies, versus if you wait till spring, you let those seed heads stay, and then you cut them back after the bees have emerged, or you don't cut them back very deep, you leave like a foot at the bottom, then you're creating a higher likelihood that pollinators will be able to overwinter and survive and thrive in your yard. And finally, you get to enjoy the seasonal changes with the Colorado escape, because Colorado is so beautiful year-round with so many colors and textures. So interesting year-round. I do want to mention real quick that if you do a matrix garden, which is my favorite type of garden, the grass flower, scrambled eggs thing, this sort of prairie restoration garden, it needs the same type of treatment that prairie would have gotten historically, meaning occasionally it needs to be burned or trampled by bison. So unless you have a herd of bison or you live someplace where your neighbor is fine with you setting fire to your front yard, I would really suggest just mowing or weed whacking it every 1 to 3 years. That will keep the grasses from taking over the flowers. And that is my whole presentation. I am very happy to answer Q&A, but I think that's all the time we've got.